My parents spent 25 years telling me I wasn't real family, using that lie to justify neglect, favoritism, and silence. Then my grandmother handed me one envelope that proved everything I'd believed was wrong, and suddenly the house, the money, and the power shifted straight into my hands without warning ever. I'm going to start where everything snapped, not where it began, because the beginning is just the excuse they used for the ending. I'm standing in my parents' backyard in suburban Connecticut, surrounded by 40 people sipping champagne like it's holy water, and my father is clinking his glass to make a speech about legacy, while I'm holding a tray of napkins like I'm hired help at my own house, in my own family, on my own birthday. And he's smiling the same smile he's worn for years. Whenever he's about to erase me in public, he wraps his arm around my brother Chase like they're a matching set, like God packaged them together and accidentally dropped me in the box, and he goes, "From the moment Chase was born, I knew he was destined for greatness." And people actually clap, like they just watched a movie where the hero wins, and I'm standing there thinking, wow, even the applause is louder than they've ever been for me. And then it happens, the part that still makes my stomach go cold when I replay it. My aunt, sweet tipsy Aunt Marisol, blurts out, "Isn't today Marin's birthday too?" And my father doesn't even flinch. He doesn't hesitate. He laughs, this tiny dismissive laugh like she told a joke, and he says, "Oh, we don't really count that. She's different." And the crowd does this uncomfortable little ripple, like a wave realizing it hit something sharp. And I swear I could feel 25 years of being treated like an inconvenience rise up in my throat at once. My mother, Elaine, gives me that look she always gives me. The one that says, "Don't ruin the vibe. Don't make this about you. Don't make us look bad." And I'm standing there watching her choose the performance again. Choose him again. Choose the image of the family over the actual human standing in front of her. And it would be easy to say I'm used to it. But the truth is you're never used to being publicly demoted in your own life. You just get better at swallowing it quietly. Then my father goes further because of course he does. He shifts from praising Chase to announcing what he thinks is the family plan, and he says, "As most of you know, Vivian owns this home, and when she eventually passes, God bless her, we plan to sell and use the proceeds to fund Chase's first business venture." And he says it like it's already signed and notarized and stamped by heaven, and my brother is nodding like he's already picking the paint color for his future office, and I'm staring at them both like, are we really doing this in front of witnesses? Are we really saying the quiet part out loud? And something inside me whispers, this isn't just favoritism. This is theft wearing a tie. That's when I finally hear my grandmother's cane tapping across the patio. Stones, slow, deliberate, like a countdown, and people part for her the way people part for authority, because Vivian doesn't need to raise her voice to make grown adults nervous. She just needs to arrive, and she walks straight up to my father, looks him dead in the face, and says his name like a verdict, Grant. And my father's smile collapses so fast it's almost funny, and she turns to him and says, "I believe you've forgotten whose house you're standing in, and you can feel the oxygen. Leave the backyard," because everyone suddenly realizes there are two stories happening at once, and they've been listening to the wrong narrator. My father tries to recover. He always tries to recover. He starts to say something about family matters and respect and what's appropriate, but Vivian doesn't even let him finish. She turns to me, and her eyes soften in a way that makes my throat tighten, and she says, "Marin, sweetheart, come with me." And when she says it, it doesn't sound like a request, it sounds like rescue. She links her arm through mine and leads me away from the tent and the champagne tower and the fake laughter, away from my mother's tight smile and my brother's smug posture, and we stop near her rose bushes at the edge of the yard where the noise dulls into a murmur and I can finally hear my own heartbeat again. Then she does something that rearranges my entire reality in one motion. She reaches into her cardigan pocket and pulls out a thick cream envelope, sealed with red wax, and the wax stamp has a symbol pressed into it, scales, like justice, and letters underneath I don't recognize yet, and she presses it into my hands like she's passing me a weapon, and she whispers, "Don't open this at home." And the way she says it is the way people talk when they're telling you the truth is about to hurt, but lying longer will kill you. My hands start shaking before I even understand why, and I ask, "Grandma, what is this?" And she looks past me toward the party, toward my father, and her voice goes quiet and sharp at the same time. It's what I set aside for you the day you were born, because I saw the way he looked at you before you even opened your eyes, and I just stare at her because what does that even mean? How could she have known? How could she have seen what I spent years trying to convince myself wasn't real? Behind us, I hear my father's voice cutting through the garden like a blade. "Mother, what are you doing?" And Vivian turns her head slightly, not even fully facing him, and says, "This is between me and my granddaughter." And then she looks back at me and adds, "Go to your car, read it alone, and then decide what you want to do." And I know she's not just telling me to read paper, she's telling me to choose who I'm going to be after I learn what's inside. I walk away with that envelope feeling heavier with each step, like it's pulling me down into the driveway, like it has gravity, and when I pass the hallway table inside the house on my way out, I see it, a lavender birthday card with my name on it in Vivian's handwriting, opened and tossed half under a stack of mail like junk, like it was read by someone who didn't even have the decency to hand it to me, and something in my chest goes hot, not sadness, not even anger, more like a clean, bright disgust, the kind that finally makes you stop negotiating for scraps. I get into my rental car and lock the doors like my family is a weather event I need shelter from, and I just sit there in the driveway with the envelope in my lap while the party noise keeps going behind me like nothing happened, because that's the thing about families like mine, they can humiliate you and still ask you to refill the ice bucket like you're part of the decor. I stare at the wax seal for a long time, and my mind starts replaying every adopted in spirit moment like it's a highlight reel of emotional fraud. 8 years old at the dinner table, asking why Chase got the bigger bedroom, and my father not even looking up from his plate before saying, "Because he's different. You're not like us. You're adopted in spirit. We chose to keep you, but you're not entitled to the same things." And my mother doing that gentle hand pat thing like she was comforting a stray dog instead of her child. 16 years old watching my brother get a cherry red Jeep and a backyard party with a DJ, then blowing out my own candles alone over a sheet cake with my name misspelled because my mother said she was in a rush. Which is a funny excuse when you remember she's never rushed for anything that mattered to me. 18, watching them fly out to move Chase into college like it was a royal procession, then handing me a bus ticket for my scholarship school because you can manage, right? And I did manage. I managed like my life depended on it because it kind of did. College years, 2 jobs, tutoring weekends, waitressing nights, graduating with debt, while my brother graduated with gifts and praise and a Rolex my father called the man of the next generation, as if I was a side character born to clap for him. Every holiday where decisions were between blood relatives, every conversation where my opinion didn't count, every time I tried to push back and my mother hit me with her favorite spell. "Why are you being selfish? Your brother needs this more than you." And I believed her, because when you grow up being treated like an extra, you start apologizing for taking up space. I sit in that car, and I realize something that makes my skin prickle. The lie wasn't just "you're adopted." The lie was "you deserve this," because they didn't just treat me differently, they trained me to accept it, they trained me to explain it away, to call cruelty tough love, to call neglect fair, to call favoritism just how it is. And I want to ask you right here, because I know I'm not the only one, if you've ever been the kid who always understood, the kid who was expected to shrink so someone else could shine, did you ever look back and realize you weren't understanding? You were being trained, you were being coached into silence, you were being conditioned to think love was something you earned by disappearing. And real quick before we go further, tell me where you're watching from, like literally drop your city or country in the comments, because I want to know how far this kind of family nonsense travels, and I want to know if this is universal or if my relatives are just especially creative with the emotional sabotage. Anyway, I'm still sitting there, engine off, hands on the envelope, and my first instinct is chaos. I'm not going to lie, I imagine marching back into that party, grabbing the microphone and going, "Surprise, your golden boy celebration is actually my birthday, and also you've been lying about me for 25 years. And watching my father choke on his own legacy speech, because that would feel good for about 12 seconds, and then my mother would cry, my father would rage, and Chase would act confused like he's never benefited from a single thing in his life, and the entire family would label me dramatic, unstable, ungrateful, and I'd be right back in the role they wrote for me. The problem child, the inconvenient truth, the girl who ruined celebrations. So instead, I do what I've learned to do as an adult who's tired of being played. I pause, I breathe, I let the adrenaline burn off, and I choose control, because control is the only language my father has ever respected. I glance at my phone, and there's already a text from my mother. Don't make a scene. Your grandmother is confused sometimes. Just come back and help, okay? And I actually laugh, not a cute laugh, a dry one, because she says confused the way people say inconvenient, the way people say she's making trouble, because that's how they survive, by invalidating anyone who threatens the story. I type nothing back because I'm done arguing with people who rewrite reality for sport. Then my phone buzzes again, and it's my brother, Chase. Hey, Dad says we're all meeting next weekend about Grandma's estate stuff. There's paperwork. No big deal. No big deal. That phrase right there is how you know someone has never paid the price for anything, because if you've ever been the one who gets stuck cleaning up messes, you learn nothing involving family money is no big deal. It's always a trap with a ribbon on it. My hands tighten around the envelope and I finally break the seal, and the wax cracks under my thumbnail with this tiny sharp sound that feels louder than it should, like a lock snapping. Inside, I pull out a few documents, thick, official, the kind of paper that makes your stomach drop, because it's the opposite of a rumor, it's the opposite of he said, she said. It's proof, and there's also a handwritten letter on lavender stationery, my grandmother's looping handwriting, and before I even read it, I have this ridiculous thought. Like my brain is trying to protect me with humor. I think, wow, even her paper smells like the truth. Like tea and patience, and the kind of love that doesn't need witnesses. I unfold the letter, and the first line hits me so hard I whisper it out loud just to hear if it sounds real. My dearest Marin, you are not adopted in spirit. You never were, and my chest actually tightens like my body is trying to decide whether to laugh or vomit, because if I'm not adopted, then what the hell was all of that? What was the point of that label? What were they buying with it? And the answer comes immediately, sharp and ugly. Permission. They bought permission to neglect me without guilt. I look down at one of the documents, and my eyes lock on a birth certificate with the raised seal, and there it is in black ink like a betrayal. Carved into stone, my mother's name, Elaine Spencer, my father's name, Grant Spencer, and my name, Marin Elise Spencer, and there's no adoption, no amendment, no asterisk, no footnote. Just the boring legal fact that I am theirs, and I always have been, which means every time my father told me I didn't belong, it wasn't confusion, it wasn't misunderstanding, it wasn't his own way, it was a choice, a deliberate, repeated choice to make me feel disposable. My hands start shaking again, but it's different now. It's not fear, it's rage mixed with relief. Because do you know what it does to a person to grow up believing they're the mistake the family tolerated, only to realize the mistake was never you? It was the story they built to justify treating you like furniture. I scan the next pages and see legal language that makes my accountant brain wake up like a bloodhound. Words like irrevocable, trust, beneficiary, dates, signatures, and I catch the year, and my throat goes tight. Again, because it's dated the year I was born, and it has my name on it. And not in the way families write your name on a cake they forgot to buy, but in the way courts write your name when something is real and enforceable. I'm sitting there in my car while the party continues behind me, and I can feel the ground under my life shifting, because if Vivian did what I think she did, if she planned what I think she planned, then my father just made a speech about selling a house he might not even own, and my brother just smiled about a business he might not be able to fund, and my mother just texted me that grandma is confused, when the only confused people are the ones who think lies stay buried forever. I flip one more page, and I see an address I know better than my own. Our house, that colonial with white shutters and the wraparound porch, listed like an asset, not like a memory. And I hear my father's voice in my head saying, real family comes first, and I almost start shaking with laughter, because if the paper says what it's starting to say, then the real family didn't come first at all. The real family got played. I stare at the documents spread across my lap, and I realize I have two options: explode in public the way they expect, or move in silence the way they fear. And I'm not 8 anymore. I'm not 16. I'm not the girl who scrubs bathrooms while the golden child rests. I'm 25, and I finally have something they never expected me to have: leverage, and I'm going to use it like a grown woman who's done begging for crumbs. My phone buzzes again, and I don't even look at it, because I'm staring at one line on the trust document that makes my heart kick like it's trying to run out of my chest. And the wild part is I can't even fully process it yet, because my brain keeps trying to protect me with denial. Like, surely I'm reading it wrong. Surely there's a catch. Surely my father wouldn't have built his whole future plan on something that was never his. But then I remember my father has never fact-checked anything in his life when it comes to me. He just declares it and expects reality to obey, and that's exactly why this is going to hurt him. Because reality doesn't care about his tone. I take a slow breath, grip the steering wheel like it's the only stable thing left, and I whisper, "No way," because right there in front of me is the kind of truth that doesn't just change what happens next, it rewrites what happened before. And I'm about to make a call to the law firm listed on the letterhead, and once I make that call, there's no going back to being the girl on the edge of the family portrait. Because the second I confirm what this document really means, I'm not just invited into the frame. I'm holding the frame in my hands, and my family still has no idea what's about to hit them. I don't go back into the party after opening that envelope because once you see the strings, you can't unsee the puppet show, and I'm not ready to watch my parents keep performing like nothing's changed. So I start the car and pull away slowly, my hands still trembling, my chest buzzing like I just touched a live wire. And as I drive down Maple Grove Lane past manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, I realize this street watched me grow up believing I was optional, watched me carry groceries while my brother was praised, watched me mow lawns and scrub sinks while my father called it character building, and now this same street is watching me leave with a truth that could collapse an entire narrative. I don't cry yet, not because I'm strong, but because my brain is in triage mode, sorting memories like evidence, replaying moments that suddenly glow with new meaning, like the time my grandmother insisted I stay in the room when family matters were discussed, and my father snapped that I didn't need to hear this, and she shot back that I was family whether he liked it or not, or the way she always hugged me just a second longer than everyone else, like she was buffering me against something she knew was coming. I pull into a grocery store parking lot because I need to stop somewhere neutral, somewhere no one knows me as the spiritually adopted kid, and I sit there rereading the first page of the trust document until the words stop blurring together. Irrevocable. Beneficiary soul. My name typed in ink that doesn't care about tone or favoritism or legacy speeches. And it hits me that this wasn't a last-minute decision. This wasn't guilt or sentimentality. This was strategy. My grandmother didn't just love me. She planned for me, and that realization is its own kind of grief because it means she saw what I was too young to name and decided to act when no one else would. I finally dial the number on the letterhead because sitting with truth without confirmation feels like holding your breath underwater, and when the receptionist answers with a calm professional voice, it almost makes me laugh because my life is currently on fire, and she's just like coal and Arden. How may I direct your call? And when I say my name, there's a pause, not a dramatic one, just enough to let me know I'm expected, and then a man's voice comes on the line, steady, unhurried, the kind of voice that doesn't panic because it's seen worse, and he says, "Marin, your grandmother told me you might call today," and I blurt out, "Is this real?" like a child asking if monsters exist, and he says, "Yes," without hesitation, and that single syllable lands harder than any speech my father has ever given. He explains the trust in careful language, confirms the date, the assets, the fact that it becomes fully enforceable on my 25th birthday, which is today. My birthday that my parents turned into my brother's celebration without blinking, and as he talks, I'm staring at the steering wheel thinking about how irony doesn't even begin to cover this, how the day they made sure I felt smallest is the day I quietly became untouchable. When I hang up, my phone lights up with missed calls from my mother, 3 of them, then a voicemail from my father that I don't listen to yet because I already know the tone, authoritative, annoyed, sprinkled with concern just thick enough to sound reasonable to outsiders, and I sit there thinking about how often concern has been used on me like a leash, something to pull me back into line. I drive back to my apartment instead of returning to the party, and that choice alone feels like rebellion because I've been conditioned to show up no matter how small they make me feel, to smile, to help, to clean up emotional messes I didn't make, and as I unlock my door and step into my studio, the quiet hits me, no speeches, no clinking glasses, no reminders of where I rank, just my space, my couch, my chipped mug, and I spread the documents out on my coffee table like I'm preparing for trial because in a way, I am not against them yet, but against the version of myself that kept apologizing for wanting fairness. I read my grandmother's letter again, slower this time, letting each sentence sink in, the way she describes watching my father look at me like disappointment made flesh. The way she admits she couldn't change him, but refused to let him erase me completely, and I realize something that makes my throat tighten. While my parents were busy teaching me I didn't belong, my grandmother was quietly building a safety net beneath me, not to spoil me, not to rescue me dramatically, but to make sure that one day, when the truth surfaced, I'd land on my feet instead of shattering. My phone buzzes again, and this time it's my brother, Chase, texting, "Where did you go?" And for a split second, the old reflex kicks in. The urge to explain myself, to smooth things over, to make sure no one's mad. But I stop because explaining has never protected me, it's only ever drained me, so I don't respond, and that silence feels like stepping into a new muscle I didn't know I had. Later that night, I finally listened to my father's voicemail, and it's exactly what I expected, irritation disguised as concern. "Marin, your grandmother upset a lot of people today. She's been confused lately. You need to come back and help calm things down." And I actually snort because of course it's my responsibility to manage the emotional fallout of his lies. Of course the daughter he ignored is now the one expected to fix the mess, and something inside me hardens, not into cruelty, but into clarity, because clarity is what happens when the fog lifts and you see patterns instead of isolated incidents. The next morning I wake up with that weird calm that comes after shock, like my nervous system finally exhaled, and I make coffee and stare out my window thinking about the years I spent measuring myself against my brother, wondering what he had that I didn't, and the answer was never talent or worth or effort. It was permission. He was permitted to take up space, to need, to receive, while I was permitted to serve, to manage, to endure, and realizing that doesn't make me hate him. It makes me angry at the system that trained us both to accept that imbalance as normal. Mid-morning, my mother shows up unannounced, standing in my doorway with that practiced look of concern and disappointment, holding flowers I don't like because she's never actually learned what I like, and she starts talking before I even sit down, telling me my father is under a lot of stress, telling me my grandmother has always favored me a little too much, telling me that family doesn't fight over money. And as she talks, I watch her carefully, not the words, but the choices underneath them, the way she's trying to reframe what happened so I'll doubt myself. So I'll doubt the paper in my hands, so I'll doubt my own memory, and I realize gaslighting isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just persistent, gentle, exhausting. She asks me if my grandmother gave me something, says it like it's casual, and when I don't answer immediately, her eyes flicker, just for a second, and I know then that they're scared, not for me, not for grandma, but for themselves, because fear is what happens when people who've benefited from a lie sense the truth approaching. She slides a document across my table, some vague family acknowledgement form, and asks me to sign it just to keep things simple, and I don't even need to read it to know it's a trap, because simplicity has never been for my benefit, and I tell her calmly that I'm not signing anything, and the way her face changes is almost impressive. The concern drops, the frustration leaks through, and she snaps that I'm being difficult, that I'm overreacting, that I should think about what's fair. And I finally say the thing I've never said out loud to her. Fair for who? And she doesn't answer, because that question has never had a good answer in this family. After she leaves, I sit on my couch shaking, not because I regret it, but because setting boundaries feels like breaking a rule you've followed your entire life, and your body hasn't caught up to the idea that you're allowed to do that. Days pass, and the calls keep coming, my father, my mother, my brother, all circling the same theme. Urgency, paperwork, family unity, and every time I hear those words now, they sound hollow, like slogans printed on a product that's been recalled, and I talk to the attorney again, who warns me not to sign anything, who explains that what they're doing is preemptive damage control, trying to lock me out before the truth is formally revealed. And it hits me that they don't actually know what my grandmother did, they just sense that she did something, and they're scrambling. And there's something almost satisfying about that, not because I want revenge, but because for once, they don't have the upper hand. One night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I replay my father's words from the party, my legacy, and I think about how legacy is such a funny word, how people use it to mean property and money and control, but what it really means is what you leave inside people, and the legacy my parents left in me was doubt, hyperindependence, and the reflex to earn love through usefulness, and I wonder how many people watching this recognize themselves in that. How many of you were taught that love was conditional, that belonging was transactional, that silence was safer than honesty? I don't sleep much that night, but not in the anxious way, more in the anticipatory way, like something big is coming and my body knows it. And when the attorney calls the next morning to tell me there will be a formal meeting the following week, that my grandmother insisted everything be done transparently, with witnesses, with no room for denial, my stomach flips, because I know that meeting isn't just about documents, it's about power, about who gets to control the narrative when the truth is read out loud. I hang up and sit there thinking about whether I'm ready for that, whether I'm ready to watch my father's confidence crack, my mother's silence become visible, my brother's entitlement collide with reality, and I won't lie to you. Part of me is scared, because confrontation with people who raised you hits different. It's not just anger, it's grief for what you never had, but another part of me feels steady, grounded in a way I've never felt before, because for the first time, I'm not walking into a family situation empty-handed. I'm walking in with facts. The night before the meeting, my father leaves another voicemail, his tone softer now, almost pleading, telling me we can work things out as a family. And I almost laugh again, because that phrase has never included me, unless I was being asked to give something up, and I realize something important. Reconciliation offered only when power shifts isn't reconciliation, it's negotiation, and I'm done negotiating my worth. I lay out my clothes for the next day. A navy suit I bought months ago but never wore because I didn't think I deserved to look that confident. And as I hang it on the door, I think about how strange it is that clothing can feel like armor. And I tell myself that tomorrow I'm not going in to fight. I'm going in to witness the truth being spoken, and whatever happens after that, whatever choices I make will be mine, not because I'm different, not because I'm adopted in spirit, but because I'm finally standing on ground that doesn't move when they tell me to shrink. And as I turn off the light, one thought keeps looping in my head, not fear, not revenge, just a quiet certainty. They still think this is about money, and they have no idea what it's really about, or how much is about to change once everything they built on a lie is forced into the open. By the time I walk into the glass building downtown the next morning, my body feels like it's running on a different operating system, calm on the surface but hyper-aware underneath. Every sound sharper, every movement slower, like the world knows something is about to be said out loud that can't be taken back. And as the elevator climbs, I catch my reflection in the mirrored wall and barely recognize the woman staring back, because for once she's not shrinking, she's bracing, and I think about how wild it is that truth doesn't always feel triumphant when you first hold it. Sometimes it feels heavy, like responsibility, like now that you know, you have to decide who you're going to be with it. The conference room is colder than I expect, polished table, leather chairs, that faint smell of lemon cleaner and money, and I sit there alone for a few minutes before anyone else arrives, my folder on the table in front of me, fingers resting on top like I'm afraid it might disappear if I let go. And my thoughts start spiraling, not about what's coming, but about what's already happened, the years of quiet compliance, the way I learned to read moods before asking questions, the way I'd scan my father's face to see if today was a safe day to exist, and it makes me angry in a clean, focused way, not explosive, not messy, just sharp. When the door opens and the attorney walks in, he greets me like this is any other Tuesday, which is oddly grounding. Because it reminds me that while this feels personal, legally it's simple, paperwork doesn't care about favoritism, and that realization alone feels like oxygen. Then the door opens again, and my parents walk in with my brother trailing behind them, and the shift in energy is immediate. My father moving toward the head of the table out of habit, my mother sitting close to him. My brother scrolling on his phone like this is an inconvenience he plans to outsource, and not one of them looks at me. Not really, which would have crushed me once, but now just confirms everything. The attorney clears his throat and begins explaining the purpose of the meeting, neutral language, estate planning, clarity, and I watch my father nod along, confident, relaxed, like a man who thinks he's about to sign off on something that's already his, and there's a moment where I almost feel sorry for him, not because he doesn't deserve what's coming, but because he has no idea how fragile his certainty actually is. The first document goes up on the screen and it's the house, the address I've memorized since childhood, and my father smiles, actually smiles, like this is proof of his legacy, and then the attorney calmly says the words that change the temperature in the room. This property is held in trust, and I watch my father's smile freeze, just slightly, like a crack in glass, and my mother's hand tightens around her purse strap. And my brother finally looks up from his phone. My father interrupts, annoyed, saying that can't be right, that the house was a wedding gift, and the attorney explains, patiently, that without a deed transfer a gift is just permission, not ownership. And I swear I can hear my own heartbeat in my ears as the realization spreads across my father's face in stages. Confusion first, then irritation, then something that looks a lot like fear. The attorney continues, laying out dates, signatures, notarizations, and when my name appears on the screen as sole beneficiary, the room goes completely silent, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, and my mother whispers my name like it's a question, and my brother mutters, "What the hell?" And my father stands up abruptly, chair scraping, demanding an explanation, and every instinct in my body screams to sit down, to stay quiet, to let the adults handle it. But I don't, because I am the adult now, and I say, evenly, that my grandmother planned this when I was born, that it's been in place my entire life, and that I didn't even know until now. My father accuses me of manipulation, of poisoning my grandmother, and I almost laugh because it's such a predictable move. The same one he's used my whole life when something doesn't go his way. Blame the person who exposed the problem instead of the problem itself. And I point out that the documents predate any adult influence I could have had. And the attorney backs me up without emotion. And that's when my father's anger shifts into desperation, his voice softening, trying to reframe, calling me sweetheart for the first time I can remember, talking about family unity, about how we can work this out internally. And that word internally makes my skin crawl because internal is where all the damage happened. My mother starts crying quietly, telling me she never meant for things to be unfair, telling me I know how my father is, and I realize something in that moment that feels like a second betrayal layered on top of the first. She knew, she always knew, and she chose comfort over courage, and I say that out loud, not cruelly, just honestly, that knowing and doing nothing is a neutrality. It's a choice, and she looks at me like she's seeing me for the first time, not as a helper, not as a problem, but as someone who can name things she doesn't want named. My brother finally speaks up, asking what this means for him, and the attorney explains that it means nothing changes for him, except that expectations need to adjust, and the way my brother reacts tells me everything, not anger, not sadness, just confusion, like a man who's always assumed the ground beneath him was solid suddenly realizing it was borrowed. And I wonder how many people in the world mistake entitlement for stability. My father tries one last time, saying that regardless of paperwork, I owe them loyalty, that they raised me, and that word "owe" hits something deep in me, because I've spent my whole life repaying a debt I never agreed to, and I tell him that loyalty without protection is just obedience, and I'm done being obedient. And the attorney clears his throat again and says we're getting off track, that the purpose of today is clarification, not negotiation. And that's when it hits me that this isn't a fight I have to win emotionally. It's already settled structurally. The meeting ends not with shouting but with stunned quiet, my parents leaving without looking at me, my brother hesitating like he wants to say something but doesn't know how. And when the door finally closes and it's just me and the attorney, I feel the adrenaline drain out of my body all at once, leaving behind a strange emptiness, not relief, not joy, just space. He asks me if I'm okay, and I tell him I think I will be, eventually. And when I step back outside into the daylight, the city feels louder, messier, more alive, and I realize I've crossed an invisible line. There's no going back to who I was before I knew this, before I said these things out loud. The days that follow are a blur of calls and messages, my parents alternating between anger and appeal, my mother sending long texts about memories that suddenly feel like bargaining chips, my father insisting this will tear the family apart, and I want to ask him when exactly he thought we were whole, but I don't, because engaging now would only pull me back into a dynamic I'm trying to step out of. My brother texts me late one night asking to talk, and I stare at my phone for a long time before responding, because part of me wants to protect him from the fallout and part of me resents that I was never protected, and that tension sits heavy in my chest. I meet him at a coffee shop a few days later, and he looks smaller somehow, less sure, and he tells me he didn't know things were that bad for me, and I believe him, which almost makes it worse because ignorance didn't stop him from benefiting. And when he asks if there's anything I can do to help him now, I realize how deeply trained he is to see me as the fixer, the buffer, and I tell him no, not this time, this is something he has to sit with. And he nods, but I can tell he doesn't fully understand yet. That night, alone in my apartment, I think about the idea of revenge, how people imagine it as fire and spectacle, but what this feels like is gravity, things falling where they were always meant to fall once the supports were removed. And I wonder how many families are built on unspoken agreements that only work as long as no one questions them. I replay the moment my father said I wasn't really family, and for the first time it doesn't sting. It just sounds inaccurate, like a typo finally corrected, and that realization brings a quiet kind of power, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. As I prepare for what comes next, the legal steps, the logistical changes, the inevitable backlash, I also start thinking about what I want, not what I should accept, and that's new territory for me. Uncomfortable but exciting. Like standing at the edge of something you were never allowed to imagine, and I can feel that this isn't the end of the story. It's the point where consequences stop being theoretical and start becoming real, where the choices I make next won't just affect how my family sees me, but how I see myself. And as much as they think this is about property and money and pride, they still don't understand the most dangerous thing I'm holding now isn't the trust, it's clarity, and once someone has that, everything else starts to shift whether anyone's ready or not. After that meeting, the world didn't explode the way movies promise it will. There were no sirens or dramatic storms, just a slow, unsettling shift where everything familiar started behaving differently, like gravity had been adjusted by a few degrees and nothing quite sat where it used to. And the first place I felt it was in my own body, because suddenly I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't scanning for danger. I wasn't rehearsing apologies in my head before speaking, and that absence of tension was almost disorienting. Like walking without a limp you didn't realize you had. The calls started that same night, my phone lighting up on the kitchen counter while I stood there staring at it, knowing exactly who it was without checking, and when I finally answered, my father didn't waste time with greetings. He went straight into accusation, telling me I'd embarrassed him, that I'd humiliated the family, that people were talking, and it struck me how quickly concern for reputation replaced concern for truth. How his first instinct wasn't to ask why this happened, or how I felt, but how it made him look, and I listened quietly while he spoke, really listened, noticing the patterns, the same phrases he'd used my entire life to shut things down, the same deflection, the same rewriting of events. And when he finally paused, expecting me to defend myself, I said something that felt almost foreign on my tongue. I said, "I'm not responsible for protecting you from consequences you created." And there was silence on the other end, so long I wondered if the call had dropped. My mother called next, her voice softer, trembling, asking if we could meet privately, just the two of us, no lawyers, no drama, and part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to think maybe this was the moment she'd finally step out of a shadow, but another part of me remembered every time she'd asked for private conversations before, how they always ended with me being asked to compromise for the sake of peace. And I told her we could talk but not to negotiate, and she agreed too quickly, which should have warned me. We met at a quiet cafe halfway between our homes, neutral territory, and she cried before I even sat down, talking about how hard things had been, how she'd been stuck in the middle, how she never meant for me to feel less than, and I watched her carefully, noticing how every sentence centered her discomfort, her confusion, her pain, and when she finally stopped to breathe, I asked her a simple question, one I'd never asked before. "Why didn't you stop him?" And she looked at me like I'd spoken another language, blinking, searching for an answer that didn't exist, and after a long pause she said she didn't know how, and in that moment something crystallized for me. Not anger but clarity, because loving someone isn't about knowing how, it's about deciding to try, and she never did. My brother texted sporadically during those days, messages that hovered between apology and entitlement, saying things like "I didn't know it was that bad for you," followed by "So what happens now with the house?" And each time I felt that old reflex kick in, the urge to explain, to soften, to make it easier for him to understand, and each time I stopped myself, realizing that understanding isn't something you can give someone who benefits from not having it. Meanwhile, the practical changes began quietly, documents filed, accounts transferred, keys duplicated, all the boring, uncinematic steps that actually change lives, and I found a strange comfort in the mundanity of it, the way reality moves forward whether people are emotionally ready or not, and every time I signed something or confirmed something I felt a small jolt of disbelief. not at the money or the property, but at the fact that someone had planned for me, had seen what I couldn't yet articulate and built a safety net I didn't even know existed. There were nights I lay awake replaying memories through this new lens. Moments that suddenly made sense. The way my grandmother always lingered a little longer when she hugged me. The way she'd ask questions no one else bothered to ask. The way she'd correct my father when he dismissed me. And I realized she'd been quietly validating me my whole life without ever undermining him openly, playing a long game that required patience I'm not sure I'll ever fully comprehend. Not everyone reacted with hostility, though, and that surprised me. An aunt I barely spoke to sent me a message saying she was proud of me. A cousin admitted she'd always felt something was off. Even a neighbor from my childhood wrote to say she hoped I was finally getting what I deserved, and each of those small acknowledgments felt like bricks being added to a foundation I'd never had, proof that my experience wasn't imaginary, that other people had seen it too. Still, the backlash from my parents intensified as reality set in, my father threatening legal action, then backtracking, then trying guilt again, telling me he'd sacrificed everything for us, rewriting history in real time, and instead of reacting, I started documenting, saving messages, noting dates, not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood the power of record, how much damage happens in spaces where nothing is written down. One afternoon, my brother showed up unannounced at my apartment, standing there awkwardly with his hands in his pockets, saying he just wanted to talk, and against my better judgment, I let him in, listening as he paced my living room talking about how unfair this all felt, how blindsided he was, how this wasn't what he'd planned for his life. And as he spoke, it dawned on me that he wasn't mourning the family dynamic, he was mourning the loss of an assumption, the assumption that resources would always be available to him without question. And when I pointed that out, he got defensive, accusing me of enjoying this, of punishing them, and I asked him to sit down and really think about that, to imagine what it's like growing up without assumption, without safety, without being centered, and he went quiet, staring at the floor, and for a brief moment I saw something like understanding flicker across his face before it disappeared under years of conditioning. After he left, I felt drained but lighter, like I'd finally stopped carrying conversations on my back alone. And that night, I did something small but symbolic. I took down the old family photo I'd kept out of habit and replaced it with nothing, leaving the wall blank, because I wasn't ready to define what belonged there yet, and that emptiness felt more honest than pretending. The days turned into weeks, and slowly the narrative around me began to change, not in their mouths but in mine. The way I spoke about my past shifted from apology to observation. I stopped saying things like, maybe I'm overreacting or it wasn't that bad, and started saying this is what happened. This is how it affected me. And that shift changed how people responded, how I responded to myself, because there's a quiet authority that comes from stating your truth without asking permission. I also started noticing how much energy I suddenly had, how much mental space opened up when I wasn't constantly managing other people's emotions, and I used that energy to think about what I actually wanted moving forward, not as a reaction to them, but as an independent trajectory. And that question, what do I want, was both thrilling and terrifying because no one had ever really asked me that before, not sincerely. I met with a financial advisor recommended by the attorney, someone who spoke to me like an equal, not a child or an inconvenience, and as we talked about options and timelines and goals, I felt something settle inside me, a sense of continuity, like my life finally had a forward line that wasn't contingent on someone else's approval. But clarity doesn't erase grief, and there were moments it hit me unexpectedly, standing in a grocery store aisle or driving past my childhood neighborhood. The realization that the family I thought I had never existed in the way I needed it to, and that mourning process was messy and nonlinear. Some days I felt empowered, other days hollow, and I let myself feel both without judgment, understanding that healing isn't about choosing one emotion and sticking to it. My mother sent a letter one evening instead of a text, handwritten, careful, apologetic, saying she was proud of me, that she hoped one day we could rebuild. And I read it 3 times before setting it aside, not ready to respond, not ready to decide, because I'd spent too long being rushed into forgiveness for other people's comfort, and this time I wanted to move at my own pace. What struck me most through all of this was how many people reached out quietly, privately, sharing their own stories of being sidelined, of being told they were too much or not enough, of discovering later in life that the rules had always been different for them, and each message reinforced something I'd been circling around but hadn't fully named yet, that this wasn't just about me or my family, it was about systems inside families that reward compliance and punish truth, that elevate some voices and silence others. And once you see that pattern, it's impossible to unsee it. As I stood in my living room one night looking at the blank wall, where the photo used to hang, I realized the biggest shift hadn't happened in that conference room or on those documents. It had happened internally. In the moment, I stopped trying to earn a place in a story that didn't make room for me and started imagining one where I was the author. And that realization came with its own kind of fear, because authors are responsible for what happens next, and there was no one left to blame or appease. The next steps loomed ahead, uncomfortable conversations not yet had, boundaries not yet tested, choices that would ripple outward whether I wanted them to or not. And I knew the calm I felt now was temporary, that escalation was coming because people who benefit from silence rarely accept it being broken without a fight. And as steady as I felt, I also knew this was just the beginning of the reckoning, the part where truth stops being abstract and starts demanding action. And whatever came next would force everyone involved, including me, to show who they really were when the old scripts no longer applied. The first real test came quietly, not with shouting or threats, but with a calendar invite that landed in my inbox like a loaded question. A family discussion, scheduled by my father for a Sunday afternoon. No agenda listed, no acknowledgement of what had already happened, just an assumption that everyone would show up and resume their roles as if the ground hadn't shifted. And I stared at that invite longer than I should have, because a year ago I would have accepted, without hesitation, would have rearranged my life to accommodate whatever emotional weather awaited me. But now I felt something new rising, not defiance exactly, more like discernment, the awareness that every yes teaches people how to treat you, and I declined with a single sentence that felt both terrifying and liberating. I'm not available for group conversations right now. If there's something specific you want to discuss, you can email me. And within minutes my phone started buzzing like I'd tripped an alarm. My mother called first, then my father, then my brother. A rapid escalation that made it painfully clear the meeting had never been about dialogue but control, about corralling everyone back into a familiar shape where nothing uncomfortable had to be examined. And when I didn't answer the calls, the messages shifted tone from confusion to irritation to accusation. My father writing that I was being dramatic, that I was letting money change me, that I was breaking the family apart. And I read those words slowly, noticing how none of them referenced his actions, his lies, his choices, only my response to them. A classic inversion that suddenly looked almost textbook once I stepped outside of it. I forwarded the messages to a folder I'd labeled simply record, not out of spite but out of self-respect. Because one of the biggest lessons I was learning was that clarity thrives on documentation while manipulation thrives on vagueness, and that small act of saving instead of reacting grounded me more than any argument ever had. A few days later, I met my grandmother for lunch at a quiet place she loved, the kind of restaurant where time seemed to slow down, and she watched me carefully as I talked, not interrupting, not steering, just listening in a way that made space instead of filling it. And when I finally stopped, she reached across the table and said something that landed heavier than anything else. She said, "You're doing the hardest part now, which is letting people be unhappy with you." And I realized she was right. That this phase wasn't about confrontation or victory, but endurance, about resisting the urge to smooth things over just to make the noise stop, because the noise was evidence that something had changed. That afternoon, she told me stories I'd never heard before, not just about my parents, but about herself, about how she'd learned the long way that love without boundaries becomes leverage, about mistakes she'd made trying to keep peace at her own expense. And listening to her felt like receiving a map I didn't know I needed, one that showed where not to go as much as where to head next. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of empowerment and loneliness, because when you step out of an old system, the silence can be jarring. There were fewer calls, fewer messages, entire stretches of days where no one from my family reached out at all. And that quiet forced me to confront how much of my identity had been built around managing those relationships, how many of my decisions had been shaped by anticipation of their reactions. And without that constant feedback loop, I had to sit with myself, with questions I'd postponed for years, like what does safety feel like when it isn't conditional? What does success look like when it isn't measured against someone else's approval? I started noticing small changes in my daily life. The way I slept more deeply, the way my shoulders didn't tense when my phone buzzed, the way I laughed more easily around friends who'd only ever known the version of me that existed outside my family's narrative, and those moments felt like proof that the tension I'd normalized wasn't inherent, that it had been learned, reinforced, and could therefore be unlearned. Of course, the backlash didn't disappear. It just changed shape. My father sent a long email framed as concern, warning me about legal repercussions, about how families like ours don't air their dirty laundry, about how I was jeopardizing relationships that could be useful to me later, and reading it I was struck by how transactional his view of connection was, how even now he framed people as resources to be managed rather than humans to be understood. And instead of replying, I forwarded the email to my attorney and asked a simple question: do I need to respond to this? And when she said no, I felt another invisible chain loosen. My brother tried a different approach, showing up again unannounced. This time with a conciliatory tone, telling me he missed how things used to be, how holidays felt easier before everything got complicated, and I asked him whose holidays because mine had always been complicated, they'd just been quiet about it, and that question hung between us unanswered, a mirror he wasn't ready to look into. Around this time I started therapy, not because I felt broken, but because I wanted language for what I was experiencing, and session after session, I found myself unearthing moments I dismissed as normal, being praised only when I was useful, being ignored when I needed support, being cast as difficult whenever I voiced discomfort, and naming those patterns didn't make me angrier. It made me calmer, because understanding the mechanics stripped them of their mystique. One exercise my therapist suggested was writing a letter I'd never send, saying everything I'd never been allowed to say. And I filled pages with memories, with anger, with grief, with questions that would never be answered honestly. And when I finished, I didn't feel closure, but I felt ownership, like I'd reclaimed pieces of myself that had been frozen in time waiting for permission to exist. The practical implications continued to ripple outward too. Neighbors from my childhood reached out cautiously, some expressing sympathy, others fishing for information. And I learned quickly who was interested in my well-being and who was interested in gossip, drawing lines where necessary, because another unexpected lesson of this phase was how easily your story can become public property once it disrupts a comfortable illusion, and protecting it became part of protecting myself. There was a moment one evening, standing alone in the house that now felt more mine each day, when the weight of everything pressed down on me at once, the loss of what I'd hoped for, the relief of what I'd escaped, the uncertainty of what came next, and I let myself cry fully, not quietly or apologetically, but openly, because grief doesn't disappear just because justice shows up, and allowing that release felt like honoring the younger version of me who'd never been allowed to be upset without consequence. Slowly, I began to envision changes not just internally but externally, redecorating rooms, hosting friends, creating rituals that had nothing to do with obligation, and everything to do with intention. And each choice, no matter how small, reinforced a new truth, that I didn't need to be chosen to belong. I could choose. The family invite never got rescheduled. Instead, it morphed into occasional pointed comments passed through third parties, warnings about how I'd regret this one day, about how forgiveness was expected, and I noticed how those messages always framed reconciliation as my responsibility, never theirs. And for the first time I saw that dynamic clearly enough to opt out of it without guilt. One night my grandmother called me unexpectedly, her voice steady but serious, and told me my father had confronted her, demanding explanations, demanding she fix what she'd caused, and she laughed softly as she recounted it, saying he still thinks this is about money, still doesn't understand that what's been exposed can't be negotiated away, and hearing her strength in that moment filled me with a quiet resolve. Because if she could withstand that pressure after a lifetime of watching this play out, so could I. As I lay in bed later that night, I thought about how many families operate on unspoken hierarchies, how often love is rationed based on compliance, how rarely the quiet child gets asked what they need, and I wondered how many people listening to this would recognize themselves in these dynamics, would feel that familiar tightening in their chest. And if that's you, I want you to pause for a second and ask yourself where you're watching from right now, what city or country you're in, what time it is there, because this moment, wherever you are, matters, and so does the part of you that's still listening. The truth is the hardest part wasn't losing their approval. It was accepting that I'd never had it to begin with, that what I'd been chasing was a moving target designed to keep me small, and once that realization settled and the path ahead became clearer, even if it wasn't easier, because clarity doesn't guarantee comfort, it just removes confusion. I knew then that the next phase would require decisions that went beyond emotional boundaries, decisions with real consequences, choices that would force everyone involved to confront realities they'd avoided for decades. And as steady as I felt in that moment, there was an undercurrent of anticipation, a sense that the calm was the eye of the storm, because systems built on denial don't dismantle themselves quietly. And whatever came next would test not just my resolve, but my willingness to stand firm when the stakes rose, when pressure turned into action. And when the question stopped being who was right and became who was ready to live with the truth once it fully arrived. What I didn't expect was how quickly power changes people when they realize the rules they relied on no longer apply, because about 2 weeks after the last confrontation, the tone of the messages shifted again. Not angry this time, but polite, almost rehearsed, like everyone had attended the same secret workshop on how to sound reasonable, and the first email came from my father with the subject line logistics, which alone told me everything I needed to know, because when someone reduces a lifetime of harm to logistics, it means they're trying to step around accountability instead of through it. And in that email, he wrote about timelines, about how moving out of the house would be disruptive, about how I should consider extending the deadline because this affects more than just you. And I remember reading that sentence slowly and thinking how fascinating it was that my entire childhood hadn't affected more than just me, enough to stop him, but now inconvenience had suddenly become a moral argument. I forwarded the email to my attorney again, then closed my laptop and went for a walk because I was learning that not every provocation deserves an immediate response, and that space is sometimes the most powerful answer. And as I walked through the neighborhood, past houses that looked like mine once did, perfect from the outside, I wondered how many of those homes hid similar stories behind their curtains. How many children had learned early that love was conditional, and how many adults were still living inside those conditions without realizing it. The next escalation came not digitally but physically, when a certified letter arrived addressed to me in my father's precise handwriting, the kind he only used for things he considered serious, and inside was a formal request for mediation, not because he wanted resolution but because mediation sounded fair, sounded like he was trying, and I could already see how he would later use that attempt as proof that I was the unreasonable one if I declined, and I sat at my kitchen table with that letter, feeling the old tug of doubt creep in, the voice that said maybe I was being too harsh, maybe I should compromise, maybe keeping the peace was still my responsibility, and it took everything in me to recognize that voice for what it was, conditioning, not intuition. I called my therapist that afternoon and read the letter aloud, and she asked me a question that cut through the noise instantly. She asked what outcome mediation would realistically produce, and when I answered honestly that it would likely pressure me into concessions while allowing my father to avoid admitting wrongdoing, she nodded and said then mediation isn't neutral here, it's just another stage for the same performance. And hearing that framed so clearly felt like someone turning on a light in a room I'd been navigating in the dark for years. I declined the mediation request politely, stating that all communication should go through legal channels, and when I hit send I felt that familiar rush of adrenaline followed by an unexpected calm, because each boundary I held made the next one slightly easier. Days later, my mother reached out directly for the first time since everything had unfolded, not with accusations but with nostalgia, texting me photos from my childhood, moments I barely remembered, asking if I recalled this vacation or that holiday, and I could feel the emotional trap forming, the attempt to soften me with selective memories, and instead of engaging I replied with one sentence that felt both honest and restrained. I remember some of those moments, but they don't erase the rest, and after that she went silent again, as if unsure how to proceed without the leverage of denial. Around this time, neighbors began contacting me about the house, asking what my plans were, offering unsolicited advice about renovations or resale, and each conversation reminded me that this wasn't just an emotional shift but a tangible one, that the abstract concept of inheritance had become daily reality, decisions that would shape my future in visible ways. And I found myself taking a strange comfort in spreadsheets and budgets, in the clarity of numbers, because unlike people they didn't gaslight, they didn't rewrite history, they simply were what they were. The first truly destabilizing moment came when my father showed up again without warning, this time not angry or pleading but composed, carrying a folder like he was heading into a meeting, and he stood on the porch waiting patiently, as if patience itself were a strategy, and when I opened the door he greeted me by name in a tone so measured it almost felt unfamiliar, and he asked if we could talk, just the two of us, and for a split second the old reflex kicked in, the urge to appease, to hear him out, to hope for something different. But then I remembered all the conversations that had gone the same way before, the apologies that never materialized, the accountability that always stopped just short of action, and I told him calmly that if he had something to say he could email it, and watching his face shift from practiced calm to barely concealed frustration was like watching a mask slip, because what he wanted wasn't dialogue, it was access. He tried a new angle then, telling me how disappointed my grandparents on his side would be if they were alive to see this, how family legacy mattered, how people were talking, and I interrupted him gently but firmly, saying I wasn't responsible for managing his image, and the look he gave me then wasn't anger or sadness but calculation, the look of someone reassessing strategy, and that was when I realized this was far from over. After he left I locked the door and leaned against it, heart pounding, not because I regretted my choice but because standing firm takes energy, and I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to ground, to remind myself that fear doesn't mean you're wrong. It often means you're changing something significant. The following week brought a twist I hadn't anticipated, a call from an extended family member I barely spoke to, informing me that my father had been telling his version of the story widely, framing himself as the victim of an ungrateful child manipulated by an overbearing grandmother, and hearing that hurt in a way I didn't expect. Not because the narrative was new, but because it highlighted how quickly people choose comfort over truth when faced with complexity, and I felt a familiar sense of isolation creep in, the fear of being misunderstood on a larger scale, and I had to consciously remind myself that reputation built on silence isn't safety, it's captivity. I drafted a statement for myself that night, not to send publicly but to clarify my own truth, outlining the facts plainly, dates, documents, patterns of behavior, and writing it felt like anchoring myself in reality, a safeguard against the erosion that comes from repeated distortion, and I saved that document knowing I might need it one day, or maybe just knowing that I could defend myself if I chose to. Meanwhile, my grandmother remained a steady presence, checking in without prying, reminding me gently that I didn't owe anyone access to my peace, and one afternoon over tea she said something that shifted my perspective again. She said, "You're not tearing the family apart. You're revealing where it was already broken," and I realized how often people confuse exposure with damage, as if pointing out a crack is worse than ignoring a collapse. The legal process moved forward quietly in the background, notices sent, timelines established, and each procedural step felt oddly grounding, because it contrasted so sharply with the emotional chaos, and I found strength in the predictability of it, in knowing that regardless of anyone's feelings the facts remained unchanged. Yet despite all this progress there were nights when doubts still crept in, when I replayed conversations in my head, wondering if there was a version of this where less was lost, and those were the moments I had to confront a hard truth, that loss was inevitable the moment I chose honesty, that some relationships only survive when one person absorbs all the harm, and opting out of that arrangement will always feel like destruction to those who benefited from it. As the move-out deadline approached, the tension escalated again, messages from my father becoming shorter, sharper, more urgent, references to legal action sprinkled in like threats meant to intimidate, and I responded only through my attorney, maintaining distance not out of spite but out of necessity, because engaging directly had always been how he regained control, and refusing that pattern felt like reclaiming my autonomy piece by piece. There was a night shortly before the deadline when I walked through the house alone, room by room, imagining the echoes of past events, birthdays I'd spent cleaning, holidays I'd spent quiet, and I felt a strange mix of grief and empowerment, because while those memories were painful, they were also proof of endurance, proof that I had survived an environment that tried to erase me, and standing there now as the person who held the keys felt surreal, like stepping into a parallel version of my own life. The morning the movers arrived, I wasn't there. I chose distance intentionally, but later that day I drove by and saw the house partially empty, furniture wrapped, boxes stacked. And instead of satisfaction, I felt a deep, steady calm. Because this wasn't about punishment, it was about alignment, about finally living in a reality that matched the truth. That evening my phone buzzed with a message from my brother, short and uncharacteristically subdued, saying he didn't know where he fit in all of this, that he felt caught between loyalties, and for the first time I felt a flicker of compassion untainted by obligation. Because he was only just beginning to confront dynamics I'd been navigating my entire life. And I replied, honestly, telling him I couldn't resolve that for him, that everyone has to decide what they're willing to see and what they're willing to sacrifice to keep things comfortable. And after sending it, I wondered how many people listening to this have felt that same pull, that pressure to carry emotional weight that isn't theirs. And I want to pause here and ask you directly, where are you watching from right now? What place in the world are you hearing this from? Because no matter where you are, these patterns show up everywhere in different languages, different cultures, but with the same core tension between truth and belonging. As night fell, I realized something else too, that the story wasn't just about inheritance or betrayal anymore. It was about what happens after the illusion breaks, about how people react when the old scripts no longer work, and I sensed that the next chapter would force even deeper reckonings. Not just about property or money, but about identity, about who everyone would be without the roles they'd clung to for decades. And as steady as I felt in my decisions, I knew the hardest confrontations might still be ahead, because when people lose access, they don't always let go quietly, and the closer the deadline came, the more unpredictable their behavior became, setting the stage for a final collision that would test everything I'd learned about boundaries, self-trust, and what it truly means to choose yourself when the cost is finally, unmistakably, real. By the time the deadline passed and the house was officially empty, I thought the storm had already peaked, but what I learned next is that for people who've lived off control for decades, losing it doesn't end the fight, it mutates it, and the first sign came quietly in the form of a notification from my bank flagged as unusual activity. Not because of a large withdrawal, but because someone had attempted to access an account that hadn't been touched in years, an old custodial account my grandmother had once opened when I was a minor, and as I stared at the alert, my stomach dropped in that familiar way that tells you something is wrong before your brain catches up, because the only people who knew about that account were my grandmother, my attorney, and my parents, and suddenly the pieces aligned in a way that made my chest feel tight, not with fear, but with disbelief at the audacity. I spent the next hour on the phone locking everything down, passwords changed, access restricted. And while the representative spoke in calm corporate tones, I could hear my father's voice in my head from years earlier, the way he used to talk about protecting family assets, as if anything he touched automatically belonged to him, and it hit me then that even after everything, even after the trust documents, the move out, the exposure, he still believed he had a claim, not legally but morally, because in his mind authority didn't come from law, it came from seniority and narrative, and he had spent his entire life narrating himself as the rightful owner of everything around him. The confirmation came 2 days later when my attorney forwarded me an email from my father's lawyer, a carefully worded inquiry asking about ancillary accounts associated with the trust, phrased as if this were a cooperative process, as if he hadn't just tried to access something without permission. And reading it, I felt something shift inside me, a final thread of hesitation snapping. Because this wasn't confusion or grief or even entitlement anymore, this was strategy, and it told me that the next phase wouldn't be emotional appeals or public narrative but legal pressure. I authorized my attorney to respond firmly, outlining the attempted access, reiterating boundaries, and making it clear that any further attempts would be documented. And when that response went out, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved, because there's a difference between winning and refusing to lose yourself, and I was firmly in the latter territory now. That night I couldn't sleep, not because I regretted anything, but because my mind kept replaying moments from my childhood through a new lens, seeing patterns I hadn't been able to name before, the way my father always controlled information, the way my mother smoothed over conflicts by minimizing them, the way silence was treated as cooperation. And I realized that what felt like a family rupture now was actually a long overdue interruption of a cycle that had been running uninterrupted for generations. The following week brought another escalation, this time from an unexpected direction, when my mother showed up at my workplace unannounced, standing in the lobby like a misplaced relic from a life I'd already outgrown, and when the receptionist called to ask if I knew her, my first instinct was to say no. Not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation, and I took a moment before agreeing to meet her in a nearby cafe. Instead, neutral ground, because I wasn't going to let her presence contaminate the one place where I felt confident and respected. She arrived with the same careful appearance she'd always maintained, hair perfectly set, posture composed, but the cracks showed immediately when she started speaking, her voice trembling as she talked about how difficult things had been, how she didn't recognize her husband anymore, how she felt caught between loyalty and morality, and as she spoke I listened. Without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to understand what she was really asking for, and it became clear quickly that this wasn't an apology. It was a plea for rescue, for me to absorb the emotional fallout of choices she still wasn't ready to own. When she finally paused, I told her something I'd rehearsed in my head many times, that I loved her but I couldn't be her buffer anymore, that protecting her from consequences had cost me too much already, and watching her face collapse under that boundary was painful in a quiet way, because it wasn't anger or manipulation this time, it was grief, real grief, for the first time, and I understood then that boundaries don't just protect you, they force others to confront realities they've avoided, and that confrontation is rarely graceful. She asked if there was any chance I'd reconsider the timeline, if maybe we could all sit down and talk again, and I answered honestly that I didn't see how another conversation would change anything unless it came with accountability, and she nodded slowly, as if hearing something she'd known but hoped wasn't true. And when we parted there were no theatrics, just a quiet acknowledgement that whatever came next wouldn't include me fixing it. The days that followed were heavy with anticipation, because silence from my father was never a good sign, and sure enough it broke with a formal notice alleging emotional distress and familial interference, a thinly veiled attempt to intimidate, to reassert dominance through paperwork. And as absurd as the claims were, they still triggered something deep in me, that old fear of being painted as the villain, and I had to sit with that discomfort, remind myself that being misunderstood by those invested in your silence is not the same as being wrong. My attorney handled it efficiently, dismantling the claims point by point, but the emotional residue lingered, and I found myself questioning how far he was willing to go, how much of his identity was tied up in winning, and that uncertainty kept me alert, cautious, because people who feel exposed often escalate. Unpredictably, around this time my grandmother's health took a sudden dip. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to shift priorities, and I spent more time with her, sitting quietly, listening to stories she'd never told before, about her own marriage, about compromises she'd regretted, about the years she'd spent watching dynamics she didn't know how to intervene in without making things worse. And one afternoon she took my hand and said something that stayed with me. She said, "Sometimes love looks like silence until silence becomes harm, and that's when speaking up becomes an act of love too." And I realized she wasn't just talking about herself, she was talking about me. As the weeks passed, the legal noise quieted, replaced by a tense stalemate, and in that lull I started making tangible changes, renovating the house not to erase the past but to reclaim the space, painting walls, rearranging rooms, choosing furniture that reflected who I was now rather than who I'd been told to be, and each decision felt like a small assertion of agency, a reminder that life continues even in the aftermath of conflict. Then came the incident that shifted everything again, the one that made me realize how far my father was willing to go to maintain his version of reality, when a distant relative called to warn me that he'd been telling people I'd coerced my grandmother, that I'd manipulated legal documents, that I was unstable and vindictive, and hearing that lit a fire in me, not because it hurt but because it crossed a line, dragging my grandmother's autonomy into his narrative, and I knew then that silence was no longer an option. I compiled everything, the attempted account access, the emails, the notice, the witness statements from the trust, and for the first time I considered going public, not out of revenge, but out of necessity, because unchecked lies grow roots. And I wasn't going to let my name become collateral damage in his refusal to accept reality. Before doing anything, I sat with a question that had guided me from the beginning: what outcome do I want? And the answer surprised me. I didn't want him punished. I wanted the behavior to stop, and sometimes the only way to stop someone is to remove their audience. I drafted a concise statement, factual, unemotional, outlining the truth without embellishment, and shared it privately with those closest to the situation. Not as an attack, but as a boundary, and the response was immediate and revealing. Some people pulled away, uncomfortable with clarity. Others reached out in quiet support, admitting they'd sensed something was wrong for years but hadn't known how to say it, and that told me everything I needed to know about who was worth keeping close. My father responded predictably, with outrage, threats, accusations, but this time they landed differently, because I could see them for what they were, last-ditch efforts to regain control. And instead of engaging, I stepped back further, letting my attorney handle communication, focusing my energy on what I could build rather than what I had to defend. There were moments of sadness, of course, moments when I grieved the family I'd wished for rather than the one I had, and I allowed myself that grief without judgment, because healing doesn't mean pretending loss doesn't hurt. It means not letting that hurt dictate your future. As the season changed and the intensity slowly faded, I realized something profound, that the biggest shift wasn't external but internal, that I no longer measured my worth against their approval, that the absence of their voices had created space for my own. And in that space, I felt a sense of alignment I'd never known, a quiet confidence rooted not in validation but in self-trust. Yet even with all this growth, I knew the story wasn't finished, because unresolved dynamics don't just disappear, they wait. And the final reckoning would come not through another confrontation, but through the choices everyone made once the dust settled, choices that would reveal who they were willing to become without the old structures to lean on. And as I stood in my newly painted living room one evening, sunlight filtering through windows that now felt truly mine, I understood that whatever came next would test not just my boundaries, but my capacity for compassion without self-sacrifice. And that the final chapter would demand a clarity even sharper than before, because when power shifts permanently, the last thing to fall is the illusion, and watching that happen would require every ounce of strength I'd gained, setting the stage for an ending that would redefine not just my relationship with my family, but my understanding of what it means to finally be free. By the time the illusion finally collapsed, it didn't do so with a scream or a courtroom verdict or some dramatic last argument. It collapsed the way all false identities do when they run out of oxygen, quietly, painfully, and in full view of the people who once believed in them. Because the final reckoning didn't come from another legal letter or another confrontation, but from something far more devastating to someone like my father, irrelevance, the moment he realized that the world had moved forward without waiting for his permission, that his version of the story no longer controlled the room, that his authority had expired the second people stopped needing his approval to believe the truth. It happened at a small family gathering weeks later, when a cousin I barely spoke to pulled me aside and said something that landed harder than any apology ever could. She said, "You know, once you stopped covering for them, everything made sense." And I felt something unclench in my chest. Because that was it. That was the real ending. Not punishment, not exile, but clarity, the kind that rewrites the past without needing to relive it. My father didn't show up to that gathering, neither did my mother, and no one asked where they were, which would have terrified him more than any confrontation ever could, because people like him don't fear consequences. They fear being forgotten. And in that silence, I saw the final consequence of a life built on domination rather than connection. You don't get to be remembered as a victim when you spent decades casting everyone else as disposable. I wish I could tell you that this realization brought instant peace. But healing doesn't work like that. It comes in waves, sometimes strong, sometimes barely noticeable, and sometimes it hits you when you're doing something ordinary like folding laundry or unlocking your door at night, and you realize no one is waiting to criticize how you did it, no one is keeping score, no one is watching for failure, and in that quiet freedom you feel grief for the version of yourself who never got to feel safe that way as a child. My grandmother saw the change before I did. She told me one afternoon while we were sitting together that my voice had changed, that I spoke without bracing myself now, without flinching before finishing a sentence, and hearing that made me realize how much of my life had been spent shrinking in advance, trying to predict reactions so I could avoid punishment, and how exhausting that kind of existence really is. The hardest part of the aftermath wasn't losing my parents. It was accepting that I'd never had them in the way I needed to begin with, that the fantasy of who they could become had kept me tethered long after the evidence said otherwise, and letting go of that fantasy felt like betrayal until I understood that it was actually loyalty to myself. People love to say that blood is thicker than water, but they never finish the thought, because survival teaches you something different. That consistency is thicker than promises, that accountability is thicker than titles, that love without safety is just a performance. And I had spent enough years applauding performances that never protected me. I didn't cut my parents off in anger. I stepped back in clarity, and there's a difference that only people who've lived it will understand, because anger still wants engagement, clarity just wants distance. My father did try one last time months later, sending a message that framed everything as a misunderstanding, as if decades of behavior were a typo that could be corrected if I just looked at it differently. And I didn't respond, not because I was afraid, not because I was tempted, but because I finally understood that responding would teach him nothing new, and silence in that moment wasn't punishment, it was alignment. What surprised me most was how much lighter life became when I stopped narrating it for people who were never listening, when decisions became about what felt grounded instead of what might keep the peace, when success stopped being a rebuttal and started being an experience. And that's when I realized that revenge stories don't always end with someone losing everything. Sometimes they end with you no longer needing them to lose it all. If you're listening to this and waiting for the moment where the people who hurt you finally admit what they did, I want to be honest with you. That moment might never come, and if it does, it often arrives hollow and late and wrapped in excuses. But what can come, what is real and attainable, is the moment where their opinion no longer has jurisdiction over your life, where you stop asking, why wasn't I enough, and start asking, why did I tolerate so little? And that shift is quieter than revenge, but infinitely more powerful. I don't hate my parents. Hatred still centers them. I understand them, and understanding is what allowed me to walk away without dragging their damage into my future, because comprehension doesn't mean reconciliation. It means freedom from confusion, and confusion is where abuse thrives. The final truth I'll leave you with is this: the story didn't end when I inherited control or when they lost theirs. It ended when I stopped organizing my life around a wound they refused to heal. And if you're still here listening, still watching, still sitting with your own version of this story, ask yourself this, and don't answer out loud unless you're ready. Who are you when you stop auditioning for people who benefit from your silence? And what kind of life could you build if you no longer needed their permission to exist? Because that's the real inheritance, and once you claim it, no one can ever take it back.